Now, I admit that I was pulled into this book by a blurb. It's very exciting when the high priestess of science fiction, Ursula Le Guin, says a new novel is intellectually daring, brilliantly imagined, and strongly felt. This one's a winner. Even more thrilling, however, is the book itself. It's a genre-bending story. It has myth, discovery, and the thirst for survival. Gilman is the author of several science fiction and fantasy works, including Halfway Human, and her work has been nominated for Nebula and Hugo Awards. Dark Orbit is very special, though, and it follows Thora, a futuristic Cassandra, who's been banished from the futuristic 20 planets of human civilization after her visions create a rebellion. Gilman's imaginative and bold novel brings us to a newly discovered habitable planet. But that ends when dark matter is discovered and murder results, leading truth to the heroine's prophetic and dark visions. Please join me in welcoming Carolyn Gilman.
Thank you very much. I love that description of the book. Boy, I want to read that book. I hope everybody's in the mood for a TED Talk tonight, because I've always wanted to give a TED Talk, and I don't think I'm ever going to get invited. So this is the closest I'm ever going to get. So that's what you're in for tonight. But first, let me just say a little bit about myself. I am a person with two identities. During the day, I'm a mild-mannered exhibit developer at the National Museum of the American Indian down on the Mall. But by night and weekends, I'm a science fiction writer. Now, a lot of people think these two professions are poles apart, but they're not, actually. They're much closer than you might think. Especially because I've done quite a number of exhibits about the history of exploration and discovery. I really first got thinking deeply about discovery when I was doing the National Lewis and Clark Bicentennial Exhibition several years back. And when I was reading Lewis and Clark's journals, it struck me how much they got wrong and why they got it wrong. They were very good when it came to observing things like mountains and rivers and grizzly bears. But when they got to observing people, they started missing a lot. And this was because they had come into the West with certain preconceptions about the people that they were going to meet. And no matter what they actually observed, they tried to fit those observations into the categories that they'd brought with them. Now, you're probably wanting an example. Before they set out, Thomas Jefferson, who was Lewis's mentor, wrote that Indian women were oppressed. He didn't know this because he'd made any great study of Indian gender relations. It was because this theory fit the governing scientific orthodoxy of the day. According to their theories of social evolution, primitive societies regarded women as chattel, as beasts of burden, as subordinate to the men. Indians were primitive, ergo Indian women must be oppressed. Well, what Lewis and Clark actually observed when they went into the West was a wide range of gender roles. When they got to the West Coast and were among the Clatsop people, they wrote rather disapprovingly in their journals about how powerful the women seemed and how meek the men were when they were in the presence of a female authority. And yet they never revised any of their conclusions about Indian women. They came back saying, oh yes, Indian women are oppressed. And historians have believed them ever since, despite the protests of actual Indian women. Now, this is the thing that occurred to me when I thought about this was, if explorers could go that wrong right here on Earth, where we're all basically of the same species, what's it going to be like when we get out into the stars and we're encountering things that are so outside our general experience, so outside what we're used to observing, that our brains and our minds and our senses aren't even evolved to detect some of these things? Well, because I wondered about this, I decided I would send a group of explorers to a very strange planet and find out how they reacted. Well, that's how Dark Orbit got its start. It's basically a thought experiment about how we're going to react when we encounter the truly incomprehensible. The explorers in my book are a fairly colorful crew. They range from an irrepressible, outspoken ethnographer named Sarah Callicott to a introspective, mystical philosopher named Thora Lassiter. But most of them are scientists. They're not prone to making stupid mistakes. However, they do share some of the same assumptions that we have. On the planet Iris, they're pitted against an environment that is so strange. The space in that area of the universe is not even stable. It's apt to crinkle up into 5-dimensional folds. And when you enter a forest on Iris, visual information is almost impossible to understand because you're surrounded with light echoes and distortions that make it impossible to understand the visual information that's coming to you. In fact, the small group of natives that they find on the planet turn out to be blind because visual information is almost useless in trying to understand the environment that they live in. And yet, just like Lewis and Clark, my scientists try to fit what they're seeing into known categories. I thought this was very likely because this impulse is absolutely fundamental to science. What science does is it tries to define things. It tries to categorize things. It tries to classify things. My point in Dark Orbit is that in a truly alien environment, these techniques of science might actually obscure as much as they reveal. In fact, the larger question I'm addressing is whether the methods of discovery that we pioneered in the 16th through 18th centuries here on Earth are even perhaps obscuring things about the nature of reality right here where we live. Our brains and our senses evolved to assure our survival. And so they're very good at detecting things that have a bearing on whether we're going to wake up tomorrow morning. We're really good at observing grizzly bears, but we're not so hot when it comes to women and other imponderable things. Now, whenever I start questioning the techniques and the methodologies of science, people tell me that I must be advocating a religious approach to reality. Well, this is because we really don't see any alternatives between the two approaches. Ever since that great science fiction writer, René Descartes, we have seen religion and science as two opposing poles that never meet in the middle. My problem is that I am dissatisfied with both explanations, but for different reasons. Religion dissatisfies me because I'm like one of those annoying kids who are always asking why. And religion seems to me like one of those annoying parents that's always answering because I said so. When you question the explanations you get from religion, often the answer is just trust me, trust me. No evidence, but believe me, it's true. Science dissatisfies me for an entirely different reason. Because it's insufficiently ambitious. The thing is that science has limited its definition of evidence to things that can be objectively verified and replicated. This leaves out vast areas of things that we know to exist. For example, anything that can't be observed is not evidence as far as science is concerned. Any occurrence that's unique is not evidence to science because it can't be replicated. Anything that can't be observed by two different people objectively is not evidence to science. And this leaves out all subjective experience, of course, things like pain and beauty and transcendence. Now, most sensible scientists will not question that the unique and the unobservable and the subjective actually exist. Every now and then you'll get a rationalist crank who will say that the things that science leaves out are not worth observing, that they're not sufficiently important. But most scientists don't go that far. They just say those things are outside the purview of science. Well, the problem that lies at the heart of dark orbit is that it's essentially just about everything is unique and unobservable and subjective. And my scientists find one example after another. First of all, they go out to the planet Iris to investigate dark matter and dark energy, that 96% of the universe that we can't observe. And we only know it exists because of its effect on the 4% of the universe that we can observe. They have a communicator that runs through quantum entanglement. This means that their only method of phoning home tunnels through a realm of reality that where the observation affects the thing observed. You know, in quantum reality, once you observe a photon as a wave, it's never going to go back to being a particle. Up until that moment, it existed in some mysterious way as both. So the observation has actually shaped the reality. Even Einstein called this spooky. When my characters land on Iris, they find that even the act of observing is built on shaky ground. All evidence, of course, comes to us through our senses in the end, but our senses are, guess what, subjective. We have no guarantee that when I look at something and say that's blue, and you look at the same thing and agree with me, that we're seeing the same thing. What I mean by blue may not be what you see when you say blue. And Iris turns out to be a place where this matters, where what you see depends on where you're standing and how you think. So what's a scientist to do? Well, my answer is not give up. Instead, the book makes a case for expanding science to embrace the unobservable and the unique and the subjective. One of the Iris expedition members, whom everybody dismisses as a crank and a madwoman, theorizes that our senses are actually bringing us much more information than we realize. You see, the 5 senses that we're used to communicate to us through the cortex of the brain, through the outer layer of the brain. However, there may be other senses that communicate to us through the inner brain. Because of that, we're not aware of them. We're not consciously aware of them. They are subconscious senses. The reason that we think they might exist is that we experience things like blind sight and premonition and intuition and revelation and out-of-body existence. And these, I am theorizing, don't happen because our brains are malfunctioning. They're happening because senses are bringing to us information about what's actually out there and the nature of things outside ourselves. And to simply discount observations like this is, in my estimation, unscientific. Well, you are probably saying to yourself right now, well, how on earth does this add up to a novel? Well, I will assure you that Dark Orbit is not a philosophy tract. It really is a novel. I have landed my researchers on a planet where the answers to some of these questions actually affect whether they're going to come back alive. They've also brought with them some more human problems that we recognize, things like political rivalry and quirky personalities and cultural differences and even mismanagement, everybody's favorite obstacle. To give you a feel for the book, I'd like to just read a very short passage. This passage happens when they have just landed on the planet, and they are just beginning to explore. The shuttle was hot and crowded inside because the guards weren't letting anyone out till the whole group was assembled. The scientists waited in various stages of impatience, irritation, and boredom till the guards had had time to circle the craft and verify its safety. The lapel radio of the inside guard sputtered with some coded message, and he opened the inner door. 2 at a time, he said. Sarah had somehow ended up at the front of the line along with Thule, so they were the first pair through. The outside air rushed in with a tangy, sour smell, and Sarah sneezed. Thule wrinkled his nose. "This place stinks," he said fastidiously. "Get used to it," Sarah said. She was feeling elated and eager. A whole new world was before them, a story just beginning. The landscape outside was blindingly bright. Squinting and fumbling for her sunshades, Sarah saw that the shuttle had landed on a level plain of grass-like plants, their blades reflective of polished metal. In contrast to the land, the sky above seemed dark. It did no good to shade her eyes with her hand because the brilliance was all from below. A warm breeze gusted across the prairie toward them, making the grass bend and dance till she had to close her dazzled eyes. Even the sound it made was strange, a harmonic whistling rather than the normal rustle. The shuttle steps were already lowered, so Sarah and Thule descended onto the soil of Iris. Sarah knelt to look at the grass. The first human scientist, she thought with a thrill, to see a non-Terran life form. She took a broad blade of grass in her hand. The top of it was like polished chrome, but the underside was rough and dull. As she ran it across her finger, a bright slit of blood appeared on her thumb. The blade edge was sharp as a razor. She put her thumb in her mouth and reached into one of her pockets for a bandage. Atlabatlo appeared from around the end of the shuttle, where he had been scanning the horizon for threats. The legs of his pants were shredded from the knee down, his shiny black boots showing through. "This is wicked grass," Sarah said. "Yes," he agreed. "We need to use caution." He sat on the steps to tuck the remains of his pants into his boots. The second pair of explorers came through the airlock, and Sarah called to them, "Tell everyone to bring sun goggles, and tuck your pants into your boots. The grass out here is like knives." For the next hour, the scientists laughed and joked like children as they took samples and recordings, any differences forgotten in the sheer wonder of it all. Mr. Gibb wandered around recording scenes of excitement and delight. Mr. Gibb is their publicist. They found that the grass was thick with tuberous plants whose only above-ground manifestation was a 3-inch spike as strong as metal and pointing straight up. It was only by sheer luck that no one had impaled a foot on one of them. Sarah had noticed a slight ticking sound near the shuttle, but thought nothing of it till one of the guards gave a curse of pain and plucked something out of his neck. They all gathered round to look. It was an insect of sorts. A silver body shaped like a straight pin, sharpened on both ends with net-like wings. It had embedded itself a 1/4 inch deep in the man's skin. Ming put it in a sample box. Now that they knew what to look for, it was easy to see a cloud of them high in the air around the shuttle, glinting in the sun. "They don't seem drawn by us," Thule observed. "It's the ship they're interested in. Our body chemistry must not appeal to them." "Lucky for us," Sarah said. It was getting close to noon, and the sea-like brilliance all around was becoming wearing, but no one wanted to gather in the shadow of the shuttle for fear of the pinflies. So when Thule rumbled something about scouting the Anomaly island, everyone wanted to go. The shuttle had landed as close to the odd gravitational feature as the pilots had dared, but it was still a mile or two away. Thule aligned the map on the screen of his navigational slate to the topography around them and pointed west. Sarah squinted into the distance. On the horizon was something irregular that would have looked like a low hill if it had not been brighter than the surrounding plain. They set out in single file across the prairie, Atlabatlo first, parting the grass carefully with a walking stick to locate spike plants and a kind of low ground cactus with metallic needles that they had also discovered in the grass. There was little conversation except for the occasional warning or exclamation when a pinfly pierced someone's coveralls. Behind her, Sarah could hear Mr. Gibb narrating notes to himself. The explorers are setting out to penetrate a virgin planet and lay her secrets bare. Iris, veiled in mystery, and so on and so forth. Their eyes were necessarily on the ground ahead, so they heard the anomaly shortly before seeing it. Over the whistling of the wind on the grass, there was a faint musical undertone, not unlike wind chimes. By now, the boundary of the area was plain to see ahead, and they came to a halt, perplexed. Sarah could make not the slightest sense of what she was looking at. One moment it looked like a vertical lake surface, the next like a mass of angular fissures, cracks in the day. For a moment she felt she was looking down over the edge of a precipice and put a foot forward to break her fall, only to find that the ground was still horizontal, though she was swaying, disoriented. "What the hell?" she breathed. Thora, beside her, was gazing in entranced fascination. "It's something our senses are not evolved to perceive," she breathed. Surprisingly, it was Mr. Gibb who figured it out. "Oh, I get it," he said suddenly. "It's a forest." "What?" Sarah could see no organic shape at all in it, at least not as humans defined organic. "The leaves are all the little reflections," he explained. "The trunks are the vertical surfaces like faceted mirrors. Some of them have these reflective fronds and streamers instead of leaves. That's why it's so hard to see the trunks." With a mental effort, Sarah could begin to see what he meant. It was like looking at a visual paradox and making herself see the two faces instead of the vase. "That is very clever," Thora said softly, "and very wrong." Wrong or not, the shimmering wall of reflections now resolved into a kind of cubist origami scene that at least made a sort of weird sense. The music was coming from inside. Cautiously, they approached the edge of the forest. Close up, Sarah had to make yet another mental effort to see the trees. Their bases looked like clumps of transparent crystal, rock sugar on a stick. Around them hung the leaves, long, dangling, prism-shaped things, transparent as glass that rang as they struck each other when stirred by the wind. The chime leaves formed a thick curtain at the forest edge, reaching almost to the ground. They cast rainbow shadows as they shifted and turned. A spectrum chased across Atlabatlo's face as he reached out with his cane to touch one of the largest leaves, nearly as tall as he. But instead of making contact with the surface, his cane passed through the leaf, and the end emerged on the other side at a 60-degree angle from the way it had gone in. Slowly he drew it out, and they gathered around to inspect it. It looked perfectly whole, unaffected. "It's got to be some sort of optical illusion," Thule said. Then, before anyone could react, he stepped forward and reached out to touch the leaf himself. His hand passed through the mirror-like surface and protruded on the other side, twisted backward at an impossible broken angle. It looked so horrible that several people gasped. But he withdrew his arm whole, looking at it curiously and wiggling his fingers. "Please be more cautious in future," Atlabatlo said gravely. "We do not have a doctor with us." "What did it feel like?" Thora asked intently. "Like passing through a surface, like water," Thule rumbled. "I don't think it is an optical illusion after all." The chime leaf had rotated in the wind, and Atlabatlo now reached out with his cane to spin it back. The instant it contacted the leaf edge, the stick fell apart in two pieces, cut as cleanly as with a silent buzzsaw. Everyone looked at Thule, glad he had not tried that experiment. "I think this would be a good place to set up some monitors," Thule said, which is, of course, how scientists always react. Gotta measure it. So, that's it. Anybody have any questions? Comments? Observations? The names. Gosh, they come bubbling up from my subconscious, from those from those senses that are not cortical senses. I honestly don't know.
I pronounce them if I'm in my head.
Oh, huh. Yeah.
What authors have had the biggest influence on you as you became more and more of a writer yourself?
Whoa. Of course, there are so many authors that have had an influence on me. I mean, I've been reading science fiction for 40, 50 years by now. When I was growing up, I would say Ursula Le Guin had the biggest influence on me. I got into science fiction the usual way, through Isaac Asimov and Robert Heinlein and all those, Theodore Sturgeon and so forth. But I think it was the new wave of the 1970s that was the formative experience that I went through in science fiction. Recently, I've been reading a lot of Ann Leckie and C.J. Cherryh, and I've discovered Ian Banks and Jack McDevitt, wonderful writers that are now, of course, influencing me today. So, yeah.
One of the best evenings in Washington ever was Ray Bradbury's appearance at the Library of Congress.
Oh, really?
And he asked every single person there what was their favorite comic book or science fiction movie. What would you have told him?
Oh, boy. I would have had a hard time answering that question because I'm, as far as movies go, I'm way behind everybody else. There are a lot of people who are much more literate on media, science fiction media, than I am. So, gosh. I mean, I can tell you oh, no, I don't even want to try that. Sorry.
In response to your TED Talk, I have a TED question in that phrasing it is going to take me a moment. But what I find interesting is, as you said in the little bit you've read, that the scientists brought their more familiar problems to unfamiliar terrain, which really plays out, quickly and also over the entire length of the book. But one of the things I'm interested in is, from your talk, what you're thinking about is the questions neither science nor religion really seem to want to touch.
Yeah.
That's what you're exploring in the book, and I just sort of want to know, if without giving everything away, plot-wise, if you can say, do you feel like you got any closer to answering them through fiction?
Well, you see, the only way that I felt that I could even raise them was through fiction. Back in the olden days, when people wanted to write philosophy, when they wanted to write science fiction, they wrote philosophy. I mean, you think about, some of the great philosophers, and really weren't they writing science fiction? And today, it's the other way around. If you want to write philosophy, you kind of have to write science fiction. Because to make people actually pay attention to some of these issues and to raise them in such a way that you can demonstrate what it is you mean. It really helps to have a story, to put people in a situation where they have to answer some of these questions. I don't think I answered them. I got some of my crazy ideas out. But I'm not sure that you can answer, because basically what I'm calling for is that we ought to be investigating some of these things. We ought to not be dismissing some of the odd phenomena that we observe, that we experience. We ought to be bringing the same kind of rigor to investigating those phenomena as we bring to investigating things that come to us by the 5 cortical senses. And our techniques may be of science may be very different when we get into that kind of investigation. That, I guess, I will have to write about in the next book, as to what some of those techniques might be. I have ideas as to how you might investigate some of these things, but I'm going to have to think of a story to go with them.
And that's my final question for me. Are you considering continuing with this group of some of these people, or are you just bursting with new characters and new stories?
Oh, I've always got so many ideas. I can't possibly write them all. I have to live to be 102, like my uncle here, before I can get them all out. Of course, I've left my characters in a little bit of a bind, because some of them have already arrived home, and some of them have to wait 58 years before they get back. And so they obviously can't get back together again right away. This is the problem with a universe where travel is limited to light speed. Yeah, it's so slow.
Thank you. More questions before we start our signing?
Thank you, everybody, for coming. I really appreciate it.